Natascha Kampusch, The Disappearance and the Beginning of Hell, a Girl in Vienna. Vienna, 1998. The Austrian capital was synonymous with order, classical music, elegant cafes, and a peaceful life. But beneath that appearance of tranquility, one of Europe's most shocking crime stories was brewing. A story that would begin with the ordinary routine of a 10-year-old girl named Natascha Maria Kampusch and would end up becoming a case that would forever mark the collective memory. Natascha was a curious, intelligent girl with a sensitive but strong character. She lived with her mother, Brigitte Cerny, in the Donaustadt district, a residential area of Vienna. Her parents were separated, and although the breakup had been a hard blow, she maintained the childlike hope that, in time, everything would return to normal. March 2nd, 1998, seemed like any other day. The girl got up early, ate breakfast, argued a bit with her mother about her school uniform, and headed off to school. What no one knew at the time was that that journey of just a few hundred meters would be the beginning of an ordeal that would last 8 years and 5 months. The kidnapping. The moment. Everything changed. It was approximately 7:30 in the morning. Natascha was walking to school when a man watched her from a white van. That man was Wolfgang Priklopil, a 35-year-old telecommunications technician, reserved, obsessive, and meticulous. He had been planning a kidnapping for months, and that morning he decided to execute his plan. Priklopil got out of the van and with quick movements intercepted the girl. Witnesses recalled seeing him force her into the vehicle, although at the time they thought it might have been a father scolding his daughter. The reality was different. Natascha had just disappeared. Her mother, noticing that she hadn't arrived at school, became desperate. The police were immediately alerted and a large-scale search began. The first few hours were frantic. School routes were checked, neighbors were interviewed, and flyers with Natascha's photo were distributed. However, the trail seemed to have vanished into thin air. The hiding place. The secret basement. Priklopil drove to his home in Strasshof an der Nordbahn, a suburb outside Vienna. There, years before, he had built a carefully designed underground shelter for his macabre plan. The hiding place wasn't a simple basement. It consisted of a series of rooms hidden behind several doors, with reinforced concrete walls and a secret access concealed inside his garage. To enter, one had to pass through a trap door and a narrow corridor that ended in a steel door. It was airtight, soundproof, and virtually impossible to detect from the outside. He took the 10-year-old girl to this dark, confined space. There began the confinement that would mark her childhood, adolescence, and the beginning of her adult life. Natascha's world was reduced to a room measuring barely 5 square meters, with no natural light and minimal contact with the outside world. The shock of the first days. For Natascha, the kidnapping wasn't something she could easily accept. During the first few days, she cried, screamed, and begged for her mother. She couldn't understand how someone could have taken her freedom like that. Priklopil, however, showed no mercy. He kept her under constant surveillance, feeding her simple meals and making it clear that he was in absolute control. In those first moments, the girl thought that perhaps the police would arrive soon, that someone would hear her cries, that hell would be short. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Very soon, she realized that no one would come to rescue her. Priklopil alternated between intimidation and psychological manipulation. He told her that the outside world was dangerous, that her family was no longer looking for her, that she belonged to him. With every word, he tried to break down her inner resistance. The investigation, a search, made mistakes. Meanwhile, the Austrian police conducted one of the largest search operations of its time. Dozens of witnesses were interviewed, all of whom claimed to have seen a white van in the area. Authorities even questioned Priklopil in the first weeks after the kidnapping, as his vehicle matched the description. However, he appeared calm, polite, and cooperative. He was a man with no criminal record, leading a seemingly normal life, which allowed him to mislead investigators. The police dismissed his name and continued the search in other directions. This was one of the most tragic flaws in the case. The opportunity to find Natasha in the early days existed, but it was lost due to a misjudgment. While the media published theories and the family desperately pleaded for help, the girl remained trapped underground, invisible to everyone. On the Vienna, Natasha left behind continued to function. Children went to school, families gathered in parks, and everyday life never stopped. For her, however, time seemed to have frozen in a windowless basement. That feeling of absolute isolation marked the first years of her captivity. Every birthday passed without candles, every Christmas without presents, every summer without sun. Outside, her mother continued to struggle with hopelessness, convinced that her daughter was still alive. The kidnapping of Natascha Kampusch was not an isolated incident, but the beginning of one of the most disturbing cases in European criminal history. While Austria tried to understand how a girl could disappear without a trace, Natasha faced the greatest challenge of her life, learning to survive under her captor's control. And although no one knew it yet, that captivity would last for more than 8 years. But how did a girl manage to withstand such torment? What strategies did she develop to survive her confinement? And above all, what was going on in the mind of Wolfgang Priklopil, the man who decided to take her childhood away? The years of captivity, a life underground. When Natascha Kampusch was dragged by Wolfgang Priklopil to that hidden cellar in Strasshof, she was barely 10 years old. No one knew that this confinement would last 3,096 days. What for the world was a police case forgotten over time, for her was a universe reduced to a windowless room, under the absolute dominion of a man who became her jailer, her executioner, and the only human face she would see for 8 years. Natasha's room measured just over 5 square meters. A mattress, a small desk, an artificial lamp and grey concrete walls. There was no natural light. Priklopil imposed the cycle of day and night at his whim. She woke up at a specific time, had to keep her room clean, perform chores around the house when he allowed it, and return to the cell when he ordered. Any disobedience was punished with physical violence or deprivation of food. Time, for her, began to lose meaning. The days were identical. Wolfgang Priklopil was an obsessive man. He controlled every detail of Natasha's life. He forced her to weigh herself frequently, controlled her diet, sometimes reducing it to minimal portions, and monitored her appearance. He wanted to shape not only her behavior, but also her body. In her early years, Natasha suffered physical abuse. Priklopil used violence to enforce obedience. But over time, he realized that psychological manipulation could be even more effective. He convinced her that there was no one outside, that her mother wasn't looking for her, that if she tried to escape, she would be captured by the police and returned to him. He even told her that he had placed explosives at the exits of the house to instill fear in her. Thus, the girl built internal mechanisms for survival. She learned to obey in essential ways, to avoid punishment, but also to reserve for herself an intimate space of resistance. Her thoughts, her memories, her imagination. The transition from childhood to adolescence. One of the most dramatic aspects of captivity was Natasha's growth within those walls. She entered as a 10-year-old girl and emerged as an 18-year-old woman. Her body changed, her mind matured, and it all happened under the watchful eye of a single man. Priklopil seemed obsessed with molding her. He gave her books, let her watch television on occasion, even educated her according to his own distorted standards. He kept her isolated from the world, but at the same time, he forced her into a relationship of total dependence. Over the years, he began allowing her to go out into the garden briefly, under strict supervision, but always accompanied by threats. These brief moments of contact with the outdoors were a cruel reminder of what freedom meant. Frustrated escape attempts. On several occasions, Natasha considered escaping, but the fear of reprisals, misinformation about the outside world, and Priklopil's threats paralyzed her. Once, she tried to make noise so a neighbor would hear her, but he responded with a beating that made the risk clear to her. On another occasion, she considered running during brief outings to the yard, but the memory of the warnings about supposed traps and explosives stopped her. Each failure reinforced the feeling of helplessness. Each punishment weakened her hope. And yet, silently, she nurtured an internal resistance. The idea that one day, somehow, she would find a way out. One of the biggest debates after her release was whether Natasha developed the so-called Stockholm Syndrome, an emotional bond with her kidnapper. She herself has denied this in several interviews, explaining that what she felt was more complex. A mixture of fear, dependence, and at the same time, survival strategies. Indeed, over the years, she began to get to know her captor intimately. She understood his routines, his obsessions, his weaknesses. This understanding allowed her to negotiate small liberties. One more book, a few extra minutes of television, a personal item. To later public opinion, these concessions seemed inexplicable. To her, they were crumbs that helped her endure confinement, a world moving forward without her. While Natasha was locked away, the world changed. Austria entered the new millennium, technology advanced, and politics transformed. In her confinement, she received only fragments of information, newscasts controlled by Priklopil, manipulated conversations. Historical time slipped away from her. At the same time, Natasha's family continued to struggle. Her mother, Brigitte, faced the pain of her absence and the constant suspicion of society. Some even blamed her, suggesting negligence. But she never stopped affirming, "My daughter is alive." Priklopil's double life. While he kept Natasha captive, Wolfgang Priklopil led a seemingly normal life on the outside. He had neighbors, worked occasionally, and maintained minimal social relationships. No one suspected what was happening in his basement. This double life increased the horror. She could chat with acquaintances on the street while, beneath her feet, a little girl grew in the darkness. The psychological wear and tear for Natasha. The years became an unbearable burden. She had lost track of time. She spent 12, 14, 16 years in confinement. The weight of isolation caused emotional breakdowns. However, she developed an inner strength that surprised even her. She clung to the idea that her life had value, that sooner or later she would regain her freedom. At times, that conviction was the only thing that kept her going. 8 years seemed like an eternity. For Natascha Kampusch, they were the threshold between childhood and adulthood, marked by the control of an obsessive man and the silent struggle of a victim who refused to completely surrender. Captivity shaped her character, destroyed part of her childhood, but also instilled in her a fierce will to survive, and that will was what ultimately led her to stage one of the most surprising escapes in criminal history. Because on August 23, 2006, after more than 3,000 days of confinement, Natasha saw an opportunity, and this time she decided not to let it slip away.